So it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitators, and I have had the pleasure of working with these folks a good bit over the years, some for many years. We have Mary Carney, who's the Director of Programming and Faculty Affairs with the University of Georgia. Wendi Jenkins, who is a USG Leadership and Institutional Development Manager with the university system. Rebecca Johnston, who is the Interim Director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Leadership at University of North Georgia. And Carl Ohrenberg, who's the Interim Associate Director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Leadership, also at the University of North Georgia. So I will now happily turn this over to them. Carl, I think you're muted.
Good morning, can everybody hear me? Welcome to the first webinar in the series offered by the Office of Faculty Development at the University System of Georgia. My name is Carl Ohrenberg, and I will start off the session for you today. Along with me, as Denise indicated, I have Wendi Jenkins from the University System Office, Mary Carney from UGA, and Rebecca Johnston also from UNG, like myself. Give me a moment to pull up the presentation for today. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully you received a handout from Denise this morning. She sent that out in an email reminding you of the meeting. So if you have that available, you can pull that out and it'll go along with our presentation today. From the registration information, we can see that a majority of you are faculty, but there's also some administrators, some other personnel present here. That helps us to direct our presentation to you. But to further help us with our presentation, we would like you to comment in the chat box on connect with. Now this can be connecting at work, or you can talk about it in a more general sense to you, but your responses will help us direct our activities today.
So Carl, this is Wendi. I'm looking at the chat, waiting for participants to share who they connect with on a daily basis. Our faculty, students in online class, of course, family members, students and colleagues. And I think we have another family, which I think is interesting, that balance that we're holding with family and work these days. Neighbors, as we all wander the streets. I love that. Students, colleagues, clients. Others in their field of study. I think that's interesting. Writing center coaches, student workers, a puppy dog, other students, families, Dungeons and Dragons players. So Carl, I'll give you a few more unique ones. We've got board meetings, committee meetings. We've got some, well, okay, so the cats are represented also. So we've got a balance between cats and dogs. That's good. We've got to keep that, definitely keep that balance. Pets are, yes, absolutely. Pets are saving us. Friends, online friends, social media contacts. So just a wide variety, Carl.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for your comments. And we will continue with the presentation. Okay, so to give a brief overview of what we'll be covering today in this session, we're going to discuss the importance of connecting with others. Now, we're going to address it in a remote session because that's how we tend to find ourselves these days, is more often than not, we're connecting remotely because of the quarantining. But these skills can also be used in a face-to-face communication as well. Then we're going to review how to implement active listening and discuss active listening techniques, followed by a reflection on communicating remote work expectations. Now, this can be communication to fellow colleagues, to supervisors, to people you supervise, and it can also be addressed regarding faculty-student relationships. And many of those things were mentioned in the chat box earlier. Thank you. And finally, as we have time, we're going to help develop some strategies for connecting with others. So at this point, I'm going to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Mary Carney, who will talk about active listening skills.
Hi, everyone. So when we talk about active listening, I want to sort of cover three main topics, which is why do we value active listening? How do we practice active listening? And then we're going to do a fun little practice that gives some sort of little sample of a skill that you'll want to develop in order to be a stronger active listener. So this, the image of all ears is something that you might want to sort of keep in your mind as you're thinking about active listening. So why do we do active listening? If you see the image there, there's some research that tells us that often when we're listening, what we're really doing is we're thinking about what we want to say, or we're waiting for the gap. We're spending a lot of time doing other things rather than really focusing on listening to what the other person is saying. And so these techniques for active listening are really meant to help us connect more deeply with other people, to listen more carefully to them. And why is that important? It builds relationships. It validates the other person, that they're important and that they're heard. It builds trust in that relationship. Trust because you have a deeper understanding of each other. It, of course, creates a deeper sense of belonging. So whether or not you're talking about creating a classroom environment in which the students belong in the class, that they feel valued by you as a professor, they feel valued by the university, because, of course, we are the primary contact for students with the university. It can help to create a sense of active listening practice within the classroom. If you're leading a research team, you want to create a sense of belonging, and also security and trust. Daniel Coyle writes in the Culture Code about the importance of developing trust and belonging in relationships, because that enables you to really open up your creativity. It allows you to feel safe to work together, to offer your ideas. And in the classroom, then that allows you to have the right mindset, right? You're not going to shut down. You're in fact going to be open to learning. You're going to be aware that your professor values you, that your professor will help you learn, so that if the material is challenging, you feel, I can do it in this environment. So building that mindset is actually part of what having strong active listening skills will help you do. And one of the reasons why we want to advocate for it. So security, safety, a sense of belonging for a stronger team and a stronger kind of classroom. Those are all reasons why we advocate for active listening. So next we want to look at, how do I do active listening? So we all listen every day. I mean, you're listening right now. So the question is, what does that look like? Are you listening actively? When you talk to your significant other, people in your family, your friend group, are you employing active listening? This is a skill you can practice every day. So 3 key components that are useful to think about are sensing, processing, and responding. So when you're sensing, one of the things you want to do is thinking about ahead of time. How can I make myself fully present so that I can be there for the person who's talking? And that means sometimes slowing things down. You might take some breaths before a big meeting or before class. You might try to have some quiet time so that you can center yourself and put aside the rush of thoughts that you're having of other things you need to do, other concerns you might have. So you can focus on the moment. You can be there fully with the person or with the class, with your lab team, in the committee meeting, whatever it is that you're doing, whether you're there as a leader or as a faculty member who's leading a class, whatever the sort of context is, how can you bring yourself to be there in a full sensory way? Sometimes that means turning off your devices if that's appropriate. making sure that you've created a space so that the person knows that you're there fully. So you think about, how do I make sure that the person at the other end of the camera, if what you're doing is remote talking, knows that I'm there with them. And so sometimes that means setting it up so that right next to the camera, you have the line of, or the grid of people who are also in the meeting with you, so that when you're talking to the camera, you're also able to look at them and to read responses. So you want to think structurally like that. You want to make sure, if possible, that you have a camera, a light behind the camera, so that your facial presence is there. Where do you have your camera positioned, right? Is it in a place where it's easy for you to talk to, easy for you to communicate that you are there 100%? So all of those kinds of sensing things involve quiet, it involves eye contact, it involves making sure that mentally you're totally there. The processing step in this means that you really stay receptive. And sometimes we can already begin to judge and formulate answers, or we might think of leading questions. We want to set that aside and instead really foster a sense of curiosity, right? What is this other person saying? What is the context in which they're communicating this, right? Let me really just process what they're saying and set aside what I'm thinking as much as you can. Track the content, right? So you may want to make notes if that's appropriate in that situation, but you want to make sure that once they're done and they pause, that you're able to feed back to them and say, is this what you mean? Did I hear this correctly? So you want to make sure that you're processing in a way that's deep and meaningful, so you can really get what they're saying, and that you build into then responding. So that means nodding, means maybe smiling, right? Or frowning and shaking your head. It just depends on what the context is. You want to make sure that they feel that you are totally there. So what is it that you think would work for the person that you're talking to in terms of your method of responding? One of the problems that we sometimes have is a tendency to interrupt. And in these online environments, right, in this video conference, that's a real big problem. And so one of the things you might think about is sort of creating and talking about, so in this environment, how are we going to structure it in a way that's going to make us less likely to interrupt each other, right? Do we want to, in fact, do a round robin of taking turns in a particular kind of way so that we can respond to one another? Or if you're doing one-on-one, make sure that you wait for the person to pause long enough. You acknowledge what they say. You paraphrase, you ask questions. You make sure that your body language responds to their body language. Maybe you lean in or you mimic some of what they've done. Right? And all of that is not just to be surface, but to deeply connect with the other person and make sure that your listening is genuinely active. In this particular moment, historically, we're really trying to build our intercultural communications, right? It's so important for us to listen to one another, to understand deeply all of what the other person is saying to us. So it's true in our relationships with students. It's true in our relationships with colleagues, right, and with peers. So you want to think about, how do I create environment, and how can I adjust my behaviors? How can I make sure that I communicate that I value all of the people around us, right? That's absolutely critical as you move through managing and thinking about how to really sense the other person, how to process what they're saying, and how to respond with curiosity, right? And with openness and with non-judgment to make sure you fully understand what they're saying. If you're in a leadership role, that's especially important, right? You want to make sure that you fully understand the context, the content, what the person is saying to you before you make decisions, right? You want to make decisions based on the reality of the situation and not on our preconceptions, right? So all of that is part of how we do active listening. So next, we're going to look a little bit at the stages or the quality of listening. So we're going to talk a little bit about Carl Trimboli, right? Or Oscar Trimboli. My apologies to Oscar. So there he offers 5 levels of quality listening. He starts with listening to yourself. So what are you bringing to this conversation, right? So oftentimes when we're in a conversation, we're really thinking our own thoughts. We're preparing what we're going to say next. We're thinking about a rebuttal or a leading question. So that's one level of listening. The next level of this listening is to sort of train ourselves to listen for the content, put aside our view, right, and the content we want to deliver, and listen instead to the content that the person there is offering us, right? What is it they're really saying? If we want to take it to the next level, we'll listen to context. What's the context in which they're offering this information for why they feel as they do, or they have the perspective that they do? What's the wider context? Are there things I might ask so I can understand that more deeply? And that brings us to the next level, which is listening for what's unsaid. So what is it that I think they're really trying to say? Can I check in and see if my interpretation of what they're trying to say is really what they are thinking, right? So that's where curiosity, question, non-judgmental openness to what the other person's perspective is absolutely critical. And then really when you're dealing with the deepest level, you know, the widest level of quality listening, you're really also listening for meaning. Right? So you have your own interpretation of what the other person is saying. Can you check in and see, so is this what you mean, right? Is this really what you're getting at? What is the deeper point that you're trying to make to me? How can I understand you even more deeply? So those are the different levels of quality listening. That's the kind of why and the how for how we do active listening. Next, it'll be fun. We're going to do a little practice with Dr. Wendi Jenkins using a technique of active listening practice.
All right. So I just had an internet blackout moment. So had to go reset the router, but glad to be back in the group, and hopefully it will hold for at least a couple of minutes while we do something kind of fun. So we're going to do some practicing of what we just talked about with active listening. So low risk, and I'm going to present the case to you first before I ask for some volunteers. But we're going to do what's called a yes and exercise. And let's see, let me get myself situated here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a volunteer, 2 volunteers. So speaker 1, what you are going to do is you are going to say a sentence to your partner. Okay, any sentence, you pick the sentence. Okay, no topic, you just say a sentence. And then speaker 2, what they will do is they are going to say a sentence back, but they have to use the last word of speaker number 1 sentence. Now I'm going to give you an example, so nobody, don't start sweating yet, okay? But if you're thinking about maybe you want to try this, be thinking about maybe coming off mute or telling me in the chat that you might be interested. So what you're going to do then is really easy. You're just going to have a conversation for a minute, which sounds like a small amount of time, but you'll see it can last a little longer. 60 seconds gets a little long when you're doing this, but it's okay. So what you're going to do is continue that pattern. And let me show you an example. So the example would be that if speaker number 1 says, no matter what I do, I always fail my math test. Speaker number 2 would say, test, I've never been good at them. And then speaker number 1 would have to use the word them. Okay, so you're using the last word of the sentence to start your next sentence. And like I said, I'm going to use my trusty timer here, my trusty cell phone. So as I'm doing that, I hopefully 2 people are willing to try this out. You can come off mute, or you can raise your hand in the chat and say, hey, I'll do it. This is low risk, everybody, I promise. It will be a fun activity. So can I get 2 people?
I'll do it.
Thanks, John. Awesome. That's fantastic. Can I get one more? Oh, okay. I've got M. Lamb. I don't know. So M. Lamb, if you want to come up and tell me what we want to call you.
Oh, sorry, Marianne. I don't know why it chose M.
That's okay. We were talking earlier about how Zoom picks your name for you sometimes. So Marianne, thank you very much. All right. So John, you are going to be speaker number 1. Marianne, you'll be speaker number 2. I've got set for a minute, and just have a conversation, 1 sentence back and forth, and your time starts now.
The rain really started falling just now.
Now it wasn't supposed to rain until later.
Later is sometimes better than now, but I think we really need this rain.
Rain would be really good for my garden.
Gardens are kind of tricky this time of the year. You don't know whether it's going to rain or the sun's going to shine.
Shine. That's a hard one to start a sentence with. Sorry. Shine. Shine. Can you see the shine on my brand new diamond?
There you go.
Yeah.
Diamonds Are Forever. At least that's one of the best movies I ever watched.
All right, and you are saved by the bell, so you didn't have to come up with something to watch. But yeah, virtual shout out to John and Marianne. Great. Now don't go off mute yet. I still need you. Okay, so stick around for me. Stick around. Yeah, very good sport, y'all. That was excellent, and it's hard maybe sometimes to just think of the next question, but I want to ask you a couple questions, so you're not off the hook yet. So stick around with me. So my first question is, and Carl's going to flip it for me. There you go. So John, what did it feel like to be the first speaker in that exercise?
I felt like there was no risk at all because I was the first and someone was going to have to build on to what I said.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the sky was the limit, right? I didn't put you in a box. You could say anything, and Marianne had to build off of that. Marianne, how did you feel as the second speaker?
I had a little tricky when he started using verbs as his last word, because we don't naturally start sentences with verbs in English. So it's like,
had to tap into that creativity, right? And I think you left the word watched, which was going to be equally as difficult, but great job of handling that. So my next question is, what was the impact? So I want to hear from both of you of having to wait to listen to that last word.
Well, fortunately, the sentences were really short, and you know, my attention span is getting shorter and shorter as the years go by. So it wasn't really that difficult. I appreciate you, Marianne, for keeping it brief.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Since we were trying to do an active listening exercise, it was very funny. My natural inclination was just to listen for the last word, to try to use that word. But it's like, no, this is an active listening exercise. I need to know and understand what he's saying so that I can respond to what he's saying, not just use the last word.
Hey, well done. Thank you. That I'll have to mail you $1 for the help there with the active listening piece. Yes, that's the point, right? Is the active listening concept is to listen to the entire sentence or the entire conversation that's being presented to you. And sometimes that's really hard, listening all the way through. John and Marianne could not begin to formulate what they were going to say next because they didn't know the last word yet. And John, I think you're right. Because you kept it quick, it was easier. But if you had longer time frames in there with the conversation, it would be more difficult, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So one more question. Other than the short sentences, what worked well in terms of giving yourself that patience to wait until the last word?
I love games, so I was a youth pastor for a good number of years earlier on. And so naturally, I just love games. I love to talk to people. I love to listen to people. And fortunately, I also had seminary courses on counseling that you must learn to listen or you can't counsel. So.
Great point. Yes, that's there's not much there. If you don't know where to go with the counseling if you're not listening. So that's an excellent point. Marianne, what worked well for you?
For me, it was more trying to just remind myself that, you know, we are active listening. And it was kind of a reminder that this is something that's when we get really busy, you know, especially when we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time in a class, sometimes we lose focus of the importance of active listening. You know, last semester, at the beginning of the semester, I had to talk, I didn't have to, but it was a review day for research papers. And I only had about 3 minutes per student to talk. So I remember a student was getting kind of frustrated with me because I was trying to talk really fast and trying to actively listen at the same time, but I wasn't really actively listening. I was just trying to get everything done. And yeah, it's one of those things I need to think about a little more, even when we only have a short amount of time.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, and so you are trying to put everything, you know, into an amount of time, but also and I'll kind of piggyback this onto the what didn't work. John or Marion, did you have any distractions in your environment while you were trying to do this, or was everything pretty focused?
Well, for me, my wife tried to call me, and so I had to, you know, pretend like she wasn't calling so I could hang in there and give you a pretty good showing. But yeah, that was the only distraction. The rain, of course, was a minor distraction because I've been hoping it would rain. But yeah, there were distractions. There always will be.
Sure, absolutely. But John, what I think probably what you didn't want to say to 128 people is, I didn't hear the last word. Can you repeat that, right?
Well, yeah, the embarrassment part, you know, and this will increase for all of you as you get older. You don't want to be that person that says what, you know, all the time. You really just don't. That just doesn't work as in a professional situation. You know?
That's true. That's true. Awesome. Marianne, any distractions on your end, or were you able to keep pretty focused?
I actually had sent my son downstairs and kind of secluded myself in here, so I didn't have to worry about distractions.
Nice.
Speaker was a little quiet on my headset, so a couple times I kind of leaned in to make sure I could hear, but that's about it.
Awesome. Okay. And so, you know, and that's one thing about working remotely. We do have these distractions going on, but in the classroom too, you know, there's so many things you're trying to manage and balance and really make sure that you're giving your attention to. So okay, so John and Marianne, again, one more time, thank you so much. You can put yourself on mute and like, you can turn your off. And so, but I just appreciate you for jumping in so quickly. What I didn't tell everybody beforehand, because sometimes this word scares people, is this is an improv exercise. So if you're interested in how improv can actually help your communication, there's a great book called Yes and. You can just Google yes, comma, and you'll see it's from some Second City participants, which is an improv group, and they've related that to the business world. And of course, we can take that and translate it into higher education. So thank you so much for being such great participants, and hopefully that is something you can practice tonight at dinner or wherever the next time you'll be around a group of people. Maybe it'll be a fun party game. You can practice having conversations using the last word of everybody's sentence. So let me know how that goes. So we're going to shift now from listening to actually being heard. So you can see on your screen, there is an image of the old string can game. And in between sending the message and receiving the message, look at all the things that can get in the way. We just talked about distractions, but really this is about now thinking about how are you sending your message? How is your communication clear? Is your message being received? And so we're going to talk through a little bit about this, because really the ultimate goal here is to make sure that the intent that you want to give and the impact of your communication are the same. So I have a diagram for you that I want to show to you, and this was adapted by from a model developed by University of California Berkeley professor Edith Ng, and it's the intent impact model. So Carl's going to pull that up for me. Here we go. It takes probably a little bit of lag, but there it is. So that is the intent impact model. And it really talks about the facilitation of understanding the intent that we have when we give a message and the impact it has. Have you ever said something to a family member? And I'll go family first because I bet this is a very common one. You said something to a family member first, and the impact was totally off. You meant it in the best of intentions, and it landed, and all of a sudden chaos ensued, or a relationship was busted, or whatever, you fill in the blank there. And that's because there's a gap. And so what happens is we judge our own communication by our intent, but we judge others' communication by the impact. And so really the goal there is to try to blend these, is to try to have some overlap between the intent and impact. So I've got a graphic up there. So instead of this gap, how can we blend? And we do that through self-awareness, through knowing how we communicate, and also taking a beat, like Mary said, to evaluate ourselves and to think about our communication so that we can eliminate the gap. Because when we eliminate the gap, what happens is then we have more of an equal, but there's an equal sign there between intent and impact. And that's your ultimate goal. So when communication and interaction are really approached optimally, using self-awareness, using some of those tips that Mary gave us earlier, the intended message can have the impact that you really want. All right, so at this time, I'm going to throw it over to Dr. Rebecca Johnston, and she is going to talk a little bit more about how to do this. So, Rebecca?
Can everybody see me? Can you guys hear and see me? Okay. All good? Okay. So thank you so much, Wendi. This next slide is really talking about what to do next. How do you package all of this information and put it into play? So using active listening to boost your communication skills. So we have a concept coined by Brené Brown, which is clear. Being clear is more kind than being unclear. And so I'm going to speak about that for just a moment before I hit the other bullets on the slide. So Brené Brown wrote a book called Dare to Lead, and all of the book is specifically speaking about leadership skills and how to implement some of these things while leading others. I think it's relevant to all of life. If you are a parent, you are a leader. If you are a colleague, you are potentially a leader by example. If you are a teacher or a professor, you are a leader. So I think these things apply to basically all of the domains within which we move as human beings. So she makes 4 primary points in the book. The first one is that no one gets hints ever. I am definitely guilty of this myself. I will feel as though I have very clearly stated something to someone else because I hinted and I nudged around the topic, when in reality I really did not communicate my expectations clearly, and as a result they were not received. So the first one is no one gets hints ever. The second one is try to paint a picture of what done looks like. If you are asking someone to do something, whether it is a child or a spouse or a student, paint what the completed picture looks like so that they fully understand your expectation. The next is to trust your team. Your team is either your family, your colleagues that you are working with, your students in the classroom. Once you clearly communicate an expectation, then trust them, because very few people function well under micromanagement, and the only way that people develop themselves as leaders is if we allow them to execute a task and then come back and evaluate that task when they have gone through the process of completing it. The fourth is a willingness to have tough conversations. If you are a non-confrontational individual, this is difficult. The problem is that when you're not willing to have confrontational or difficult conversations, you're not clearly or directly communicating with the people that you must communicate with. So part of that is vulnerability. I think when we avoid tough conversations, we're doing it because those are uncomfortable for us. I don't think most people enjoy having to communicate things that might be perceived as critical or as difficult to other people, but we have to make ourselves vulnerable to that discomfort in order to clearly communicate. To elaborate just a little bit on those 4 points very quickly before we go back to the slide, Brene makes the point that feeding people half-truths to make them feel better, which is almost always about making ourselves feel better, is unkind. She makes the point that not getting clear, not being clear with a colleague or a student about expectations because it feels hard, and then afterwards holding them accountable or blaming them for not delivering what we expected is unkind. That talking about people rather than directly to them is unkind. I think we can all relate to that. And that it's easier to say, if you are the recipient of a difficult conversation, it's easier to say, okay, I've got it, and run away, than it is to sit down and honestly engage with the tough conversation. So we're going to go back to the other bullets on the slide. Video versus phone. So in this remote environment, we obviously have a lot of confounding variables that we don't have to deal with in a normal face-to-face environment. Among them, in general, with remote communication, is that about 70% of what we communicate to others and what we receive from others is nonverbal. That becomes difficult in the remote environment because a lot of the nonverbal is lost. So let's talk about video versus phone. When you're speaking with somebody on the phone, you have no nonverbal communication to pay attention to whatsoever. So in some ways, it's easier to implement active listening when you are speaking to someone on the phone. You only have audio and you can pay extreme attention to the content that someone is giving to you. When you are communicating via video, however, you lose a great deal of the nonverbal communication that we expect to have when we're speaking to someone and looking at their image. We lose that, but also because depending upon the platform you're using or what the complications are, it's easy for those nonverbals to become hyper accented because we are sitting and staring at a video image of someone. So being aware of all of those variables is critical. The next issue regarding being clear is to communicate clear work hours and expectations. And I'm going to move down just a little bit here. Oh, sorry. In other words, it's important for us to be clear to others regarding how and when they can reach us. This applies to students if you're teaching in an online environment. This applies to colleagues if you are working on joint projects together. This applies to family members if you have parameters within which you must work. It's important to very clearly communicate those things to others, because if you don't, they're going to be attempting to reach you during hours that you cannot reasonably be reached. That will frustrate you, and because you are not responding, it will frustrate them. So clearly communicating those things is best. And then finally, when you're working in a remote environment and you're working on clarity of communication, a lot of that communication occurs asynchronously, meaning you're having to communicate via email. As a result, it's important for you to send back and forth with colleagues regular progress notes. This is true whether or not you are the person leading or whether or not you are a team member working on a project. It's important for everybody to understand where everyone else is in the process. And Carl, if you don't mind, could you change the slide? I lost my screen. Oh, sorry, I'm having a technology issue. Okay, so creating spaces within which to connect remotely. There are 4 primary areas I'm going to talk about here. The first is clearly communicating the parameters within which you are going to work. The second is creating effective workspace in general.
The third is minimizing distractions within that workspace. And the fourth is making sure that all of your technology is completely set up and prepared for use. So in order to make sure that your intent in communication with others in a remote environment overlaps with the impact that you have, let's take a moment to consider the following things. The first is your parameters. What is the meeting format? What is your agenda? What is the length that you intend for the meeting? What is the content? What are all of the parameters within which you all will be working? It's critical to clearly communicate those things. The second is creating an effective workspace. And I think at this point, because we've all been working from home for, what has it been now, 3 months? Has it been 3 months? About 3 months. Since we've all been working from home, we've had a lot of experience navigating the potential pitfalls we have in attempting to create remote workspaces. So taking the time, to set up your workspace to ensure effective communications is critical for everything that you will do. It's important to have a designated workspace that is probably not your kitchen or your den or some other place that cannot be specifically contained. It should be organized. There's a great deal of research suggesting that the visual stimuli that you get even indirectly can be distracting, and therefore the environment you're working in needs to be organized. It should be free from distractions. This includes all distractions, whether they are auditory, visual, physical. It's important to get up and to dress as you normally would every day. And that the workspace contains the necessary technology to execute every task you will need to execute, whether that is writing utensils, paper, water. Specifically, if you are in a meeting, it's not a good practice to stand up and walk away to get a glass of water in the middle of the meeting. So making sure that you have everything you need around you is important. Regarding minimizing distractions, this is definitely one of the most difficult things to accomplish. Oral and particularly oral distractions, if you have pets or family members in the home, or if you have children, those are difficult. So I think it's important to communicate clearly, reciprocally, your expectations for your parameters, the time that you're going to be working, and to communicate very clearly that you will take breaks and that you can engage with others during those breaks. And to be very, very clear with everyone who is in the remote workspace, while at the same time acknowledging that some distractions are always going to be inevitable. Finally, your technology. I am definitely the pot calling the kettle black at this particular moment, because I had a meeting with my co-presenters yesterday, and right in the middle of a sentence, my computer died because I had not plugged it in and did not have the charger with me. That is not, definitely not a good or best practice. So in setting up your workspace, please be sure that you have chargers, all technologies that you may potentially need, that you have the appropriate device necessary to host the particular platform within which you will be engaging. All of those variables are critical and important. Carl, I am going to turn it over to you. This is Dr. Carl Ohrenberg, our Interim Associate Director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Leadership at UNG.
Thank you, Becky. And it's up to me to bring us home. So circling back around to hit some of the key points from our presentation today. First, use active listening to strengthen your connections. And several things involved with active listening. First is the sensing, which includes making sure that you have appropriate eye contact and that you're particularly paying attention to what the speaker says and does not say, and not necessarily thinking about what you're going to say next. So this also includes processing, which is where we're listening carefully and being receptive to the speaker's ideas and feelings, and being curious about what they're going to say and what they're communicating to you. And as Mary pointed out, that it's important to keep opinions and comments to yourself at this point. Then finally, we have responding, where we're providing verbal and nonverbal acknowledgement to what the speaker has said, And that was indicated in our active learning exercise, where the person had to listen to what was said so they could build on the last word and repeat it. And so when you're listening to someone after you've provided some verbal and nonverbal acknowledgement, in that you can summarize what they said so they can understand that you have heard what they have said. And then also it's important to give some positive feedback to what they have said. I'm going to interject something here that my wife and I have been doing for quite some time. It's something called drive-through talking. And in drive-through talking, the person says whatever they're going to say. And you know, as you go through the drive-through, you make your order. And we make your order, the person on the other end of the microphone repeats back to you, you asked for 2 fries and a Coke, which of course you asked for a hamburger and a shake. So the communication was broken, right? So then you repeat, no, my order was. Okay, so you do the same sort, you can do the same sort of thing with the person you're talking with, right? This is what I heard you say. And if that's the person agrees, if not, the person says, no, I didn't hear that, I didn't say that, I didn't intend that at all. This goes back to the intent impact model, right? The intent of what you said wasn't the impact, and so the person corrects you and you go, oh, okay. I misunderstood what you said, and then you respond and you correct that gap between intent and impact. Another thing we covered was making sure that you over-communicate your expectations. And a key thing to remember here is that being clear is kind. And when it comes to the faculty-student relationship, being clear, and remember that we can use the TILT model, transparency in learning and teaching. And as Denise posted a while ago, we have a seminar later in the series that will cover transparency in learning and teaching, and I encourage you all to participate in that. And then lastly, we talked about creating an effective environment for reciprocal communication. That includes the actual physical workspace. It includes communicating the time parameters and content of the conversation and a variety of others. So now we would like to hear from you again. And if you could please respond in the chat box to what is one strategy you will use this week to improve your connection, something we talked about during our session today. So go ahead and provide your comments in the chat box.
All right, Carl, this is Wendy again. I'm going to be monitoring it for you. So hopefully everybody is putting some thoughts in. All right, so what does done look like? Definitely a Brene Brown concept of painting it done, yes. Okay, setting up workspace ahead of time. Thinking about how you want that, to look. Better job of focusing on what the other person's saying, just decreasing distractions, clear expectations. Over communicate expectations. Oh, I love this. Not everything requires an instant answer. Maybe taking a beat, taking a pause. Listen to the end, no interruptions. Intent equals impact. Okay, so clear work hours is also something that's coming up. Oh, this is interesting. Duplicates of important announcements as a discussion post, as an email, and a reminder. So making sure you're doing that over communication. Listen to what students are saying, processing and responding, eliminating distractions. And one thing too, Carl, while some more answers are coming in, I think it's, and this may have been said, but just making sure that over communicating does not necessarily mean more emails. So thinking about how you can over communicate without filling up our inboxes is something that's important.
Absolutely.
Oh, somebody really like the drive-through technique, eliminating distractions. Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And if you have any particular questions about anything we've covered, you can provide those in the chat box at this point too, and we'll try to address them. Just a few things to finish up. Here are some resources we used in preparing this presentation, and included in these resources are links to other resources that may be a benefit to you as you're following up with what we've talked about. They're available in the handout that was distributed and linked to in the chat box. And then I wanted to draw your attention to these last couple of references or resources. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are significant parts of our mission in the Academy and as faculty members and as academics. And clear communication, which we've been talking about, is key to understanding one another and understanding these issues. And so here are a couple of resources that are directed towards that. One from the AAC&U, and then one that I'd like to direct your attention to is this first one, the webpage entitled Strike for Black Lives. That's an event that's happening today in support of our Black colleagues in response to recent events. And the link has resources designed to facilitate communication and understanding of the issues facing our Black coworkers and students, particularly in the STEM fields.